right, welcome to the Traction Reaction broadcast. I'm Steve Zautke, and joining us, it's Emmy Award-winning broadcaster, someone I grew up listening to on the radio and on TV. His latest book is Hello, I'm Paul Page. It's race day in Indianapolis. It's a must-read, I must say. Welcome, Paul Page. How are you doing today?
Hey, how are you doing, Steve? Good to see you.
Thank you. I guess we should start from the beginning, right? I mean, how did you get your start in radio?
Well, I always, in high school, thought of doing something in radio because I took a couple of radio classes and was part of a group that went up to Waukegan radio station WKRS and would do a little student program, and I really liked that. But then and when I headed off to college at the University of Tulsa, I took their broadcasting courses. But I only lasted a year there, and the Army came looking for me. So I spent a little while in the Army, but I had a great year. I got to tell you that. It was my parents didn't appreciate it, but I had a good time. Anyhow, so when I got out of the military, I came back to Indianapolis with the idea of getting close to the 500 in some way. And since I did have some training in broadcasting, I really looked to be a disc jockey somewhere. And I had a couple of jobs. One, the station was all classical and jazz. The second one, when 2 weeks after I was hired, it went full automation. So I ended up getting a news job at WIBC in Indianapolis, which is where Sid Collins, my mentor, was the sports director. And he took me under his wing and taught me the trade, and then said that I had the job. So that's how it happened.
You know, you mentioned it on the Dinner with Racers podcast, and as we like to joke on my old radio show and now doing the podcast, it's the one podcast we endorse. We've had Ryan on the show and that, but you mentioned, and this is someone who, anybody my age, roughly my age, who was just too young to witness him race, Jimmy Clark. You had the opportunity actually to interview Jimmy Clark. I take it would have been.
I actually have somewhere here. Hold on, don't go away.
Oh, very cool.
That's me and Jimmy.
Excellent.
So yeah, he was really special, and I had it was just that he would talk to me at that age, and like that, he was very friendly and very open, and I had like no portfolio whatsoever. In fact, if you look at the picture carefully, I have a temporary garage pass is all I have. But he was very cordial, very helpful. And then one day while he was in town, he did a special ride and drive out at Indianapolis Raceway Park on the 2.5 mile road course. And I got to do that. It's like, oh, so cool. He actually didn't hammer it or anything. He just kind of showed you the line and that, but still, it was Jimmy Clark, for goodness sake.
Exactly. Well, what kind of car was that?
Oh, I forget. It was some passenger car. It wasn't, okay. Wasn't a race vehicle, no.
Something from Paul Harvey Ford or something, right?
Yeah, probably like that. Yeah, exactly.
You mentioned also, you're with your Formula Ford background. I have a friend of mine, Jacques Dries, saying he does a Formula Ford podcast himself. And I gotta get you two hooked up.
Yeah, you got to give me the link to that. I
will do that. And he mentioned, it's funny because you meet people in racing and their interests in parts of racing that you're not really interested. You become. I have a friend of mine who's in the overhead conversions, like for Ford Model Ts and A's and that ran in sprint cars in the 20s and 30s. I had no idea that existed. I'm suddenly, next thing you know, I'm doing the research and digging into it and finding it so interesting. Same thing now with Jacques, with the Formula Ford stuff. I've been turning my head and tuning into that. And then you mentioned it too. And you mentioned a Formula Ford race that you raced with, and someone, another driver, as a kid, I took note of, and unfortunately had an unfortunate end. That's BJ Swanson. Tell us that story.
BJ.
Yeah.
Well, there's actually two stories there. Of course, BJ was killed going into turn 1 at Mid-Ohio. And just at the time his career was ready to take off. He was sponsored by a company called County Line Cheese. But when I got to actually have a chance with him, I had rented an ADF, which at the time was the high technology. I was transitioning from my Lotus 51 Formula Ford to an Eldon Mark 10C. So for June sprints, I had this, and it was like 80 car subscription at Road America.
Yeah.
You know? So I'm like in row 10, 11, somewhere in there. And VJ was ahead of us, and race started, and we're like, I think at Canada Corner, where suddenly I see him go off. And it happened so fast, I didn't get to see what actually happened. But it was maybe a lap or so later that here came BJ. Now I'm driving the most sophisticated Formula Ford there is, the ADF. And his car now has no body work on it whatsoever. It's kind of a Formula Ford go-kart. And he zooms past me. I mean, he was such a skillful driver. That was a fun time.
Yeah, he certainly was. So many of those drivers like him that you wonder what could have happened.
Yeah,
and he is
great. I really thought so. I really liked him. I was a big fan.
Yeah, you talked to people around that when he was coming up through the ranks, and yeah, he had a lot of talent there.
He did.
You talked about your first Indianapolis 500. This is interesting. Was 1960,
right?
And that was also my father's first Indy 500.
Oh, that's cool.
And there are a few of those. It seems like for whatever reason, 60 and 64, it seems like there's a lot of new people that mentioned that was my first race. It's one of those two races. But anybody that witnesses the 60 race and have seen races after, they all say that by hands down, it was the best race they ever saw.
Yeah. And because Rathman and Ward were going at it every corner. Now, at that time, we didn't have computerized scoring or anything, so they were generally scoring at the line, hand scoring, but they also had some people doing it in the corners, but it was not really reliable. So a lot of the passes never got actually recorded, that if you go back and look at whatever charts they have. But those two hammered at each other, and it was just something to watch. And of course, I'm totally new to the thing. I'm sent down from then my home in Highland Park, Illinois, and my parents made me come. I didn't want to go. I want to see 500. They only turn left. I'm a Formula One kind of guy because I'd been with my family. We were stationed in Stuttgart, Germany for a couple of years, so I was into Formula One. I went, and the race hadn't started. And I was fully into it. Just that giant crowd and all the pageantry, and then the race was now I say the second best race I've ever seen. But yeah, it just sucked me in. I knew I wanted to be a part of that.
Yeah, when you're a kid, when you go to your first race, a large scale race like that, and it's so many people say the same thing, that it's that pre-race, the pageantry, not only that, but the colors of the cars. When you're younger at that age, they just seem to be so much more vivid to you.
Right, and they sparkle.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly. And then of course you take this travel. It takes you to school, to into the Army, and back to Indianapolis, and you meet up with Sid Collins.
Yeah.
So tell us what happens.
So I'm working in the news department at WIBC. I want to say this is 1970, and I'd been assigned by the news department to go out and cover the soapbox derby at Wilbur Hill here on the west side of Indianapolis off of 30th Street. And I interviewed the winner, and I sent the tape back to the studio for airing, and it aired. And I come back to the studio, and Sid is standing in the hallway, and he's got his arms crossed, and he looks at me and he says, "That's the worst interview I have ever heard. I'm dead. I mean, I got to go find another job because it's all over." But then he took me back into one of the studios, one of the larger studios, and started teaching me how to interview. And then he'd tell me other stuff. And this just went on and on. But almost every time we did something, he'd say, "I'm just trying to help you out here, but there is no place for you on the radio network." So, but I got a master's degree in broadcasting out of Sid Collins at the time. And then of course in 1973 they had just that terrible 3-day race, And so after that, they made a lot of physical changes to the racetrack, including extending the pits. So Sid reasoned that he needed a fourth pit reporter to cover that distance, and called me in the office one day, me and Jerry Baker at the same time, said, "You guys are on a radio network." And, we tried to be cool until we got to the parking lot, and then, wow. And then, of course, in 77, I took over as the anchor for the 500. So that he was a huge person just in general. That, I think what he did with the radio network starting in 1952, if he hadn't have done that, I'm not so sure the Speedway would have necessarily attained its glory. It might have come close, and I could be totally wrong, but I do remember listening to him when we were in Germany on then the Armed Forces Radio Network, now the American Forces Radio Network. And what he did was magic. Again, I'm not an Indy fan at that moment, but I'm an Indianapolis kid, generally speaking. And it brought me home. And, he made the whole thing live. And without that, I don't think there are a lot of people, I don't think it would have gotten its global signature that it ended up with, or it would have taken longer. But he had the magic to make you want to come to Indy.
It's interesting when the Speedway, well, for many years there was a lot of bootlegs, but the old races, there was collectors and that you would able to get a copy here and there, and you listen to them. Now they're pretty much readily available. But it is so interesting because especially if you're able to listen to them and maybe just sit in a chair, you can visualize it. I mean, the description of everything. And I loved how he would coach, and you can certainly explain this better than I can, but it's not just a red car. What type of red car is it?
No, you had to be really definitive. It would be a brilliant blue or a teal, or you really had to describe the car for him, and you had to make it live. And he would, after races, he'd write little notes. Of course, I was right there at the station, so he'd talk to me and said, "Well, this you might want to improve on the way you did that." He was a magnificent mentor and teacher.
A lot of people may not be aware of this, but he had people from all the stations work the race, didn't he?
Yeah, that's kind of a good story. By the way, at IndyCarRadio.com, you can get all of the races on audio. So if you haven't heard him, that's how you can do it.
I will put a link.
It's worth it.
Yeah, I'll put a link in here on that.
Well, when Sid envisioned doing this, which was in 1952, it had been previously covered only by the Mutual Radio Network. And their coverage was, reports sporadically throughout the race. So you maybe wait 40 minutes before you got next report on the Indy 500. So Sid went to Mr. Holman, who owned the Speedway, and suggested this radio network. And everybody thought it was a foolish idea. But Tony apparently told Sid, according to Sid, that he said, "Well, let's give this kid a chance." And at that time, there are no satellites. The only way you're going to get that signal with broadcast quality to a station is using AT&T long lines, which meant that every station that came on the network, you had to call AT&T, and they route all over the place to get that signal to the station. So that by itself was complex. And there weren't enough people to actually do the race if you just took out of Sid's station. So he made an agreement with everybody in Indianapolis, all of the stations, and they all supplied engineers who were at that time necessary to run the equipment in the turns as well as in the broadcast booth, and had this group of announcers from each station, and it worked. And he made it work, and he taught them. And I think it was like 52 stations the first year, but when I took over, it was like 1,300 stations.
1977, of course, the 500 was significant for several things. There are a lot of storylines going in. You, of course, were taking over as the voice of the 500. We had Janet Guthrie. AJ Foyt ends up getting his fourth win, and at the time we didn't know it, but that was Tony Holman's last 500 race.
Right.
Going into it, is it doing the race when that green flag fell and the race started, did the nervousness go away? Was there any anticipation? Tell us what your emotions were.
Well, you're a broadcaster, so you kind of know you're nervous as can be beforehand. Jittery, the stage fright is full, and I kind of calmed that down by standing in the booth and getting my stuff all ready and all that. But then just before we're ready to go on the air, my producer, Jack Morrow, walks over to me and puts his hand out and shakes my hand. And he said, Paul, there are 110 million listeners out there. Don't screw it up. But once you get into it, once the flow goes, now your brain is working on broadcasting, and the rest of it does go away eventually. But yeah, it was a pretty big moment. You
got into television as racing and with the expansion of cable television and that, I'm sure you cover it in your book. You mentioned how you kind of hooked up the late Bob Jenkins with ESPN,
right?
Kind of flippantly over. I'm sure you mentioned that in there. But tell us how you went from radio and moved into television.
Well, in 1978, I was trying to create a radio network through the Speedway to cover the entire season. And we did it one season, but it was a financial disaster, so we never repeated it. But with the 500 in 78, my profile was obviously a bit higher. And I was asked to do a CBS race on television with Ken Squire, and Dan Gurney was the analyst. And then it was at Texas World Speedway, which doesn't exist anymore. And it was a kind of an interesting event, being my first. There was a sheriff parked outside of the truck, and apparently the people who were providing the truck for the broadcast had some issues and hadn't paid all the money. And so the sheriff was there. As soon as it was off the air, he's going to repossess the trucks. And I had to start the race down, and it was all cabled then. We didn't have any RF anything, so it's mic cables. And I had to start the race. My bit was in between the rows and kind of walk back through the rows. And in the middle of all that, we broke away because the Pope had died. So that was my CBS experience. Then NBC asked me to do a race that included a USAC stock car race at Michigan International Speedway. And that went well. And a couple of weeks later, I got calls from both of them offering me a position. Certainly not a full time, but
right.
Something they could see me a little more and evaluate me. And I really had to think about it a lot. And my decision came down to NBC for a couple of reasons. Ken was a NASCAR guy, huge NASCAR guy. And while I enjoyed NASCAR and I broadcast NASCAR, obviously closest to my heart are the Indy cars. And so I chose NBC, and the producer and the executive producer at the time at NBC Sports was a guy named Don Ohlmeyer, who loved auto racing. And in the fall of '79, he not only, I'd done a couple of races by then, and that's when NBC closed the contract to do all of the kart series. And so I did the very first kart race, and things just took off from there. Some of it was on ESPN, some wasn't. But that was how I finally made that adjustment there. Then in 1986, finally the Speedway allowed the television to go live, with the exception of the Indianapolis market. And it didn't go all that well in 86 and 87. The Speedway wasn't happy with the product, and I think a lot of other people weren't. And it's calling a car race is different than doing any stick and ball game. So they kind of put those guys in a pretty awkward position to ask them to do that and not have the intimate understanding of the 500. So ABC came to me and asked if I would do it. And I went to the Holman family. I went to Mary Holman and said, is this something you want me to do? And they said, yeah. And so I took off with ABC. And in our first 2 years, we won Emmy Awards for the best sports special. And that's only been replicated by the New York Yankees. So I felt pretty proud about that, back-to-back Emmys.
And of course, the old famous Open too, the Indianapolis Open, that was so famous for so many years.
My cult. I love those. The Delta Force Opens,
yes,
is what you're referring to, which you can put my name and Delta Force up on YouTube, and you can see all.
And I didn't know it was Delta Force until the boys pointed it out to us. So I was like
yeah.
you, I did not know until years later. It's like, oh, I figured, oh, you guys found this music somewhere, but I never knew it was from a movie. So
Well, those what we call teases, those opens,
yep.
And the idea is to grab the audience and keep them there. And we had experimented, I think, in '88 with a little of Delta Force within the tease, and maybe a touch in '89. But then we finally said, look, let's just take Delta Force and run with it. And the way they were put together is Don Ohlmeyer would go into the trucks and he'd point out, this is a visual medium. So he would lay all of the pictures together that he wanted in some sort of an order that he wouldn't tell me. And then he'd hand me the video and say, okay, write to this. And it was a challenge, but it was so much fun. And I'm really proud of having done those. I'm really pretty proud of all that.
As someone, I don't consider myself a pioneer or anything by far for either, video or radio, but I did come in right at the end of the old tape, and I've edited tape, videotape and whatnot. And I know how much of a hassle that was. When
he was in the truck literally for three solid days, probably 18-hour days.
Unbelievable how time consuming that was. Yes.
Yeah, and of course in those days too, when you did the voiceover for that, you couldn't stop. You had to do the whole read perfect.
Yeah.
If you didn't, you had to go back to the beginning. So I really had to be on my game to be able to do it too. Now you could, with nonlinear editing and everything, you can do anything you want.
Yep. You can cut and trim. I'll be doing that. I edit out my ums and my ohs. It drives me nuts.
I'm glad we have the editing capabilities we have now. It's
certainly do. Uncle Bobby Unser, of course. Why did he call you father?
I don't know. He just started doing it. I never quite understood it, to tell you the truth, and I never asked him about it. It just became a thing. I think he did that because I was the anchor and he was the analyst. And he conceived that, but I always called him Uncle Bobby. I called him other names too, but and he'd call me father. And when I do remember the first time that he did it was when he got his win taken away from him and awarded to Mario. And I not only was on the air, but I worked at that time at a local television station, and we had all the video that ABC had, because we're an ABC station. Plus, we had all the video that we had shot, and Bobby and I would sit there for hours and look at that video to try to find something that would explain what had happened. And it was late one night. We're down. It was Channel 13, and they were at 14th and Meridian here in Indianapolis. And he looks at me and I said, Bobby, I don't understand all this. Why would you do it? You're risking that. And he said, that's when he says, well, Father, if I'd known it was wrong, I never would have done it. Okay, Bobby.
Yep.
Of course, he wasn't the only one that did the same thing. Mario did too, and a bunch of other guys did. I do remember when I started doing the pits for radio, I had the North Pit and there were no speed limits. So cars were coming past me at 160 miles an hour. And Bobby would use the pits to advance himself, just zoom right through them, because the yellow didn't, at that time, didn't necessarily hit the pits and everything. Bobby was sneaky.
He
loved it.
He knew the loopholes.
He did. He did.
And he studied them. He spent many a nights wondering how to get that little competitive advantage. So we've been blessed to work with many people in racing. Of course, we had an opportunity to work together for an SVRA event a few years ago. But who's one that may impressed you that might surprise us?
A broadcaster?
Yeah, broadcaster, anybody. Whether it was like you worked with Roger. I mean, the people you worked with, a lot of people I'd forgotten you worked with Roger Ward. Of course, Dan Gurney you worked with, but who's whether it's radio, TV, anything that kind of surprised us, that really impressed you?
Well, obviously, and he was my buddy. We were both race fans together. Bob Jenkins, God rest his soul, just passed away recently. he had such a love and passion for the sport as well as I did. So when I created that network to cover the whole series in '78, I brought him on full time, and there were just the two of us as announcers, and we'd pick up local people to complete the network. But he and I just we had the same passion for it. So, and he had a unique way of presenting it. So I really admire him. Little known, I think, is that I worked with Roger Penske as my analyst at the first Formula One race at Caesar's Palace, and he impressed me because he had his assistants make up a book, I swear it was this thick, of all the notes for the race and on everything. And of course, he did what we all do. He went and read that in his room and made sure he was up to date on all the stats. But then he brought it to the booth, and I said, Roger, you're not going to have a chance to even turn a page in that. And he didn't. But it was fun, especially from Roger's point of view of just racing in general. He brought some magic to it. Now, a year ago, he was inducted into the National Association of Sportscasters Hall of Fame. I didn't get it. Roger got it. So, no, it's appropriate. I mean, that's a great name to have in there.
You know, Roger knew the power of media, and he always, you know, if he was able to, I don't want to say exploit it, but was able to use it, he certainly was going to do that. And
well, the other thing that he did is he had the same passion. That's why I was so happy when he was the one that bought the Speedway, because it wasn't just going to be a business. He loved racing, and passion comes through in your voice. The audience hears that, and they see it, and they know it. And so Roger's one of those that has the passion, like you and I and so many others.
You know, I'd forgotten. I looked at your Facebook page. You have some very neat photos on there, and one of them is when you traveled to the USSR. And tell us some of the places I think you mentioned too on the other podcast. I think you went to Budapest. I think you covered.
Yeah, in fact, in the back of the book, which is "Hello, I'm Paul Page." It's race day in Indianapolis. It's kind of there in the background. I have a list of all the other events, because the nature of network television, if you were going to get a full-time contract, that essentially was at least 26 events at a minimum to be considered full-time, and there weren't that many races. Okay. So I had to do these other events, and I had a knack for doing strange events. So I got to do sumo wrestling for several years in a row, which was a free trip to Tokyo. Sure. And that's when their electronics were first coming on. So I'd come home with this bag full of crazy electronics, and the people at customs would just look at me and say, "What's the matter with you?" I think I bought a kimono that had LEDs or something. But I did the Rubik's Cube World Championship from the Opera House in Budapest. And of course, I just did about it. I did one called the Arcata to Ferndale Kinetic Sculpture Race. Look it up sometimes. It's crazy. It's a 3-day race. It starts in Arcata, and they travel all over the country. The sculptures are things with wheels on them, or at least can roll. And whatever you have as people on them, you can use the same number to push it. So it's really hard to understand. But one of the sculptures, kinetic sculptures, was called the Bedroom Bordello, and it had New Orleans kind of red lights on it, and women sitting on stools, and men in tuxedos pushing it. So that was, and give you another flavor of the event. On the at the morning of each of the 2 race days, they would parachute gin fizzes to the competitors on the beach. That, by the way, never made the air. I don't know why.
Who was your favorite driver growing up?
Well, growing up, it was Eddie Sachs.
Okay.
I had in 1960, 61, really, I really became an avid Eddie Sachs fan. And I wrote him a fan letter and told him I was, maybe interested in the 500, maybe as a journalist or something. And he wrote me back. And it shocked me because it came on stationery for the Champion Sparkplug 100-mile-an-hour club, which doesn't exist anymore, but was very special then. And he encouraged me to do what I was going to do. And he essentially said, if you want to do it, you can do it. So go do it. And then, of course, in '64, he was killed at the Speedway, and that was a heartbreaker. But he was my first really big hero.
I was 14 years old. I wrote a letter to CART. And there was something about, there was some controversy even then about, I think it might have been they were going to drop when they dropped the Bettenhausen August race. And they were, and I sent them a letter, and I got a letter back from John Frasco.
Really?
Yes.
Really?
And it was typed out, but it was signatured, and it was, I was like, wow, this is really, I wasn't really expecting this. And that kind of, those little things, those little pushes that push you along. And so I'm a big advocate for anybody who's young in the sport to help them. Because I mean, all of us,
absolutely,
somewhere along the way, we wouldn't be where we are. Those, little pushes along the way. And,
despite how cool they sometimes act, I think all of the drivers love that, and they'll respond to it, and they especially respond very well to kids, along the fence and the pits at the Speedway and everything. I think they're special that way, that they will answer things like that, and they will do long autograph sessions and not charge for the autograph, that sort of thing. So drivers are super, and I think all of them also have a special feeling for people who are handicapped. For some reason, as soon as they see somebody like that, they'll go right over there and start talking to them. And they're incredibly wonderful people.
Certainly is. And Paul, we certainly appreciate you taking time out, and tell us, how can we get the book?
Well, you can go online to Amazon, and it's right there. Its title is Hello, I'm Paul Page. It's race day in Indianapolis. And of course, it's race day in Indianapolis was one of my standard openings. I'd get past the T's and everything, but somewhere in there I'd say, and it's race day in Indianapolis. And so I decided to use that. And it's done very well, and I'm proud of it. Many people tell me it reads easily, which I'm glad to hear. I co-wrote it with a guy named John Elrod, who did a lot of the skillful writing. I tell him the stories, and then we'd work on how to present them. And we decided to make it a history as well as anecdotes. And I had felt that the best history of the Indy 500 ended in 1959. It was a book called 500 Miles to Go. It was written by Al Blemker, and it's a great narrative. It really brought you into racing. So I wanted to pick up with my first race, which was 1960, and bring it forward to the 100th running of the 500, and that's what I did. And so you get a little bit of history in and out of there too, and then you get my look at what was happening in the background on those.
Very good. I'll put some links in the comments below too on how to get the book. And Paul, we certainly appreciate you taking time out. And next time I'm down in Indianapolis, we'll have to hook up again.
Hey, it's been a lot of fun. I really appreciate it. Good seeing you again too.
Okay, likewise. Thank you, Paul. We'll be in touch.
Take care.
All right.